out. But on behalf of that group, I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion called Making the Leap, Transitioning from Med-Ed Researcher to Education Research Lab PI. Many educators, especially those in our group who are doing research, have expressed frustration that the benefits of working in a dedicated research lab, things like funding opportunities, support staff, formal mentoring relationships, improved collaboration abilities and opportunities for multi-institutional research feel unavailable to them, or to the extent that they are available, they're hard to use and they seemed primarily reserved for clinical and basic science counterparts. So we've invited a panel of education scientists that have experience in a variety of lab structures to help you feel more empowered to address those sorts of challenges. We hope that by the end of the discussion, you'll have gained insights into the benefits and challenges of creating an education research lab, consider whether and how that could help you reach your career goals, explore readiness, and identify strategies that promote the success of education research labs more generally. So I'd like to briefly introduce you to the panelists today. Joining us are Teresa Chan from McMaster University, Simiao Lee Sauerwein from Ohio State, or the Ohio State University, excuse me, and ALM, John Burkhart from the University of Michigan, and Michael Gisandi from Stanford University. None of us have any relevant disclosures. Each of them will discuss the structure of their work and their affiliated labs and institutions in more detail, and then we'll take questions from you all. If you have questions as they're talking, go ahead and pop them into the chat, and then the other moderators and I will take a look at them and we'll get them answered for you. John, would you like to start? Put you on the spot.
Sure. That would be fine, but I have to admit, I was kind of hoping to be kind of under the radar a little bit, because in this kind of august panel, I think I'm the farthest, or the farthest to go, the least developed in my lab structures. So hopefully it will be more a sign of this is what starting out looks like for those of you interested in this space, versus this is the machine that others have already built in or are doing so great. But with those caveats, I will just tell you a little about myself. I'm at the University of Michigan. As you can see, the Block M and a winged helmet in the background, which doubles up on my Michiganness. I'm an MD PhD. I got my PhD in higher ed. I finished it in 2019. I did it kind of part-time while I was a junior faculty member. And the things that I'm most interested in are kind of educational policy issues, educational policy regarding equity and accountability. And that's kind of how I've tried to frame my work as a thematic thing. And that's what I've tried to build as I've started to launch this idea of a lab. And I owe a lot to the other people on this panel for giving me ideas. And I've stolen just without conscience from their best work and how I've tried to set things up. So I've stolen like Mike's idea for a clever acronym. I've stolen some of Teresa Chan's organizational style. So I'm not going to talk a ton about that because they're going to tell you how to do it right, and I can tell you how to do it kind of right. But the things that I've tried to think about are, what do I care most about, and how can I build a community? I've really tried to think about community as the underlying structure for my lab, and I've been intentional to the point that I've named it the Prime Collective, because I mean it to be a collective, not a hierarchical system. And I talk of myself as a primary investigator, but not as the principal. Because I'm the one that I think is driving a lot of the ship, and people join or come out as their work aligns with this work, but it isn't that I'm in charge of them. So I don't have perhaps the same structures that some other medical education labs have. It's more of a commune. And I named it PRIME based off of, again, an acronym: Policy Analysis, Research, and Innovation in Medical Education. And as I talked about, I kind of had these three themes: equity, accountability, and bravery as the watchwords for what we do. To that end, I built a lab website that is still half finished. I use Slack channels and recurring meetings to try and bring a sense of community. As for research funding, we've gone for a few different places. We don't have the same money as some of the other my colleagues are probably going to talk about. I brought in money from foundations. I have funding from SAM that we've in the past. I have Macy funding. I have Fulbright funding. I've gotten internal grants. Michigan has a strong internal grant program that has helped fund a lot of our work. And then I'm always looking for new spaces. So we put an RWJ letter of intent out. We're developing an R grant to go out in the NIH world because a lot of our work, the policy analysis issues are translational, looking at patient care outcomes. And so looking at a broad way of funding this work so that you can get one tent pole to kind of help hold things up. So I don't have the same tent poles that perhaps other people do already. But I think that's enough about me, and I will defer to others to give better versions of what I've just said. So thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to have a conversation.
Simiao, can we ask you to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So I am a assistant residency program director and assistant professor at The Ohio State. So we are John's sort of south of the border neighbors. And I'm also the chief academic officer of the Academic Life and Emergency Medicine Education Research Lab and Incubator. And because that is a mouthful, we also have a neat acronym, which is the EARLY. So really the motivation for forming the early is because I am also a sort of early career faculty member and researcher. And I'm rounding out my third year as faculty. And, I've previously been involved in academic and life and emergency medicine with the Wellness Think Tank. So as the chief academic officer for that organization as well. And essentially we discovered that we're able to form a successful research line. So it wasn't necessarily one-off, research projects related to wellness. We really had started to develop a body of work. And so I felt like as the person who was coordinating these efforts that we should have something a little bit more organized and a way to move forward so that we could have this really cohesive, functional team of collaborators. The lab structure in the Allium early is fairly flat. And so we don't have, sort of maybe the traditional sort of gradations of faculty and things like that. Essentially, I just pulled the people that I thought were awesome and who were great collaborators, and we've just gone forward from there. In terms of the primary research emphasis, so I had mentioned wellness before. So one of our main foci is physician well-being. So in 2017, even before my time and involvement in the Allium Wellness Think Tank, they had done a national resident burnout survey, which was published. And so essentially, that has been most of the sort of direction of our efforts at this point. So in addition to looking at this huge data set that we're able to collect from there, we've also moved forward with a national survey of wellness innovations across residency programs to look at sort of the key effective interventions in residencies since the ACGME wellness sort of mandates across residencies. In terms of primary funding mechanisms, so far our projects have been funded a little bit through non-traditional sources. So they haven't been large grants, but we've been able to find collaborations from specific sort of entities across emergency medicine who've been able to chip in a little bit here or there to help with things like participant incentives. So I think that's probably enough of a bite-sized introduction, and we can move on to our next presenter.
Teresa.
All right, so my name is Teresa Chan, and I'm at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada. I am an adjunct scientist in the McMaster Education, Research, Innovation, and Theory Lab. Well, not lab, I guess it's a group. where there's a loose association of a bunch of different education scholars, including people like Jonathan Charbonneau, Sandra Montero, and Lawrence Grierson, Meredith Vanstone, Matthew Sibbald. It's interdisciplinary, so there's people who are psychologists, people who are PhD, well, Jeff Norman is in our group technically. He's an emeritus professor, and he used to be a physicist. That's how he has his claim to fame, is that he's a physicist in medical education. And it's an interesting group. I was encouraged a couple of years ago by John Charbonneau, who's the head of that unit, to, he was like, I want you to have a lab. I'm like, okay, what's that look like? And he's like, I don't know. I don't have one. And then I went forth and tried to construct what I thought would be a good lab. I, in the heat of the pandemic, decided that maybe we should have a collaborative space where we could have a digital lab. And so we created something called the Teach Hub. Actually, Teach is actually the acronym. So technology and education, technology, education, and research hub, collaboration hub, sorry. And it's a place where people just kind of hang out. Brokart's there now, Simia, I think you're there intermittently. There's different interest groups. It's meant to be a collaborative, like what John's created. And it's supposed to be flat. There is a little bit of hierarchy within the teams just because of mentorship reasons. And we have like 180 people in the Teach Hub, and people can run their own labs within it. So like you don't have to have a freestanding Slack workspace. This is so that we can have collaboration spaces where people can talk to each other and pick each other's brains. So we have all the sim ed kind of like people they have their own space where they can discuss things. There's also the people who do like health services research or AI enhanced research. Like, so each of the groups has their own collaborative space, and then people have their own labs, and then people break out and have papers actually, or grants. So for instance, there's like dozens of paper channels right now where it becomes a single source of truth. You don't have to think too hard. You just have to like, okay, I got to go to work on this paper. It's in the workspace. And it's got its own channels. So you don't have to, like there's very few people that subscribe to all the channels like I do. Most people only have like a curated list of 2 or 3 projects they're working on. So to them, it's manageable. It's a little bit not so manageable for me because I've got so much writing done to go. But yeah, definitely check it out. And yeah, Jasandi's put in the chat there that they have a decent website for Merit as well. But I definitely think that having a website is good. I've also been part of a research collaborative called the Metric Study Collaborative. And so that's a amorphous, asynchronous, multinational team that basically works on the metric studies. So we started with metric study 1, which was to look at validation of at the social media index, which is hosted on Ilium, and trying to figure out impact and quality for blogs and podcasts. On the flip side, we went on to do metric study 2, which was about podcasts. Metric study 3 is ongoing and finishing off. We'll be presenting some stuff later today about frontline providers and how their interests and needs are different from expert users, like some of the people like Jasandi here and Simia, who are very avid in social media. So we're exploring some of that. And Metric Study 4 is about to launch, and we've started a soft launch right now. We're going to be looking at the financing of foam. So that's a different group, completely separate from the hub. Thank you, Jasandi, for putting the metric study. The coolest part of the metric study webpage is that if you go to the bar at the top, it says research agenda. If you go to that, it summarizes basically all of our research in the order in which we want you to read it. So it's like the director's cut of the literature kind of thing. And so we have all our papers kind of in order, not just in the sequence in which they were published, because sometimes some journals were faster than others. And so that's the idea, is to see, it's kind of like the Snyder cut version of our research, right? Like it's like exactly in the way that we want it to be, not after corporations and editors had their way with it. And most of the stuff that's open access, we've linked directly to it, or a pre-press version. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple of different groups that I've worked with, and they function in different ways.
That means Mike's up.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to be here with you all. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origin of our lab, and then I'm going to tell you about the lab. So I was at Northwestern as a faculty member for 14 years, and near the end of my tenure there, I started a medical education scholarship fellowship, an SAM approved version. And that was sort of my first inkling of having a lab. And the lab consisted of me meeting with my fellows on a weekly basis and doing collaborative work, and realizing that I liked working with fellows more than I liked working with residents on scholarly projects for a variety of reasons. And that the trainees really brought so much joy to my career at a time when I needed some joy in my career. I was a PD for, I don't know, 5 years at that point, and that might be the lifespan. So I needed a little something, and the fellowship did that. When I moved to Stanford in 2017, the organization of how labs work at Stanford just had to force a lab for us. I'll explain why that is. So first, I'm kind of a siloed person. I've built a team now, but originally when I got there, I was siloed. I was the only medical education researcher in our investigator line. I still am in my department, but I've hired a lot of CEs that are really wonderful big name researchers like Holly Credewire and Stephanie Seebach-Sire and sort of folks you read about all the time, but they're in educator tracks currently. So the variances of vagrancies rather of these different tracks is that I can be a PI on a grant and they cannot. So I have to sponsor all of the work done by all of the CEs in medical education. So that's problematic. And I remain the only member in that line in my department. Investigators at Stanford in this line generally have like multiple R's when they go up for even associate professor. So I'm very different. And that's got a lot of advantages in some ways, but it also has disadvantages because I'm siloed in my department. And there's like one of me in anesthesia and one of me in OBGYN. And our Academy of Educators doesn't really touch on education research. So that made some problems. The other impetus for the lab is that when I would chat with medical students who wanted to do summer research with me, or I should say I wanted to do summer research with them. There's a really robust medical student research funding mechanism at Stanford. They would ask me what I did, and I would explain it, and they would be very interested when I was done. But if I said my lab studies blah, 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 then they thought, well, I'll be a student in the Gisandi lab. I absolutely want to do that, right? And that became the nomenclature that I realized works culturally at Stanford. You have to be in the whoever lab, the Chan lab, the Burkhart lab. And I put a couple of examples of labs from Stanford in the chat. So I quickly realized that we had to have a lab and we had to call it something. And despite whatever Simeon and Teresa might think, my ego is not big enough to have the Gisandi lab. I didn't think that I had that street cred with all the R's and things that other labs have. So we made a collective lab, just like John is talking about, called the Pearl. And I'll show you our website as I just sort of describe it. And let me make sure I'm on the right screen. Oh, I'm also going to teach a Zoom trick I learned. You guys want to learn a Zoom trick? So when you go to share your screen, choose advanced. You know this already? And then you're going to choose PowerPoint as virtual background. You click on it, and it's going to ask you for a website. And I'm going to put that in. Oops, you have to use a PowerPoint. Oh, I failed. You have to use a PowerPoint. Content from second camera. Nope, I failed. Basic. We're going back to basic, everybody. If you chose a PowerPoint slide deck instead of a website, you would appear in the corner like a newscaster with your slides behind you. And it's really, really cool. But apparently you can't do it with a website. So anyway, so this is the Pearl. So the Precision Education Assessment Research Lab. And this is my collective. So Holly Credewire, Stephanie Seebach-Sire, and myself. We gave ourselves strategic names. So I'm the principal of the labs. Instead of the Gisandi lab, I'm just the principal of the Pearl. And then they are senior research investigators, despite only being 3 or 4 years out of training and just out of her PhD program a couple of years ago. But we felt if we didn't use the word scientist or investigator, an education researcher doesn't get enough street cred. So let's call them scientists. And then they have more training than most people, so let's call them senior. And then we could take lots of other faculty and trainees into our lab at some point. And those folks are highlighted in our About Us and our people. So we try to make sure that everyone's work is valued. So all of our fellows that we train in medical simulation and med ed are all automatically in our lab, and their publications are listed here, their grants are listed here. And then all of our students, both our medical students, summer students, and external students and undergraduate students that are in our lab, all also part of the lab, and they love being part of the lab. And then we have a news section, some of our research and such. So you can look at it at your leisure, but having a lab was important. Having a website was very important. We were going for the AMA grant. I should say Holly is the PI, and she was going for the AMA grant, Reimagining Residency Grant. And I was very concerned that if they couldn't find the Pearl online, we didn't actually exist. So during the period of time when we got after the letter of intent and we got down into the final 33, I was all about building this website because I wanted them to be able to find it once the reviewers were looking at it. So we created the website so that we could be an entity. And we had a lab launch where we had Vic Brazel come up from Australia, and she gave the keynote. It was really awesome. And we meet 3 times a week. There is a medical educators fellows conference every Tuesday for an hour, and all of our education faculty and our sim and med ed fellows attend that. That's lab sponsored. It's followed by a research works in progress hour. And then later in the day, Steph, Holly, and I meet with our admin to just do like an oversight meeting. So Tuesdays tend to be a busy day. We do have an administrative assistant directed at the lab that's funded through the AMA grant. And the AMA grant gave us like $1.3 million of funding. So I'm going to tell you, we've had like 1.8 million, but 1.5 is Holly. So I can't take credit for that. But the rest of them are trainee grants and things like that. So we've had a lot of success. And since everyone's attributing everything to everyone else, I built the lab off of merit. I thought such great things about the merit lab at Mac, and I really tried to emulate that. So I'll stop talking there.
Thank you all for sharing your background with us. As I'm listening to you, one thing that seemed different for some of you was the idea of how you knew that it needed to be started. Like Teresa basically said she was voluntold, and the structure at Stanford required Mike to just go and do it this way. But especially for John and Simeo, I wonder, like, what was the galvanizing point at which you knew this was the right way forward?
Maybe I'll start if that's okay. First of all, I don't know if it's the right way going forward. It seems like a way, which is, I think, sometimes what really it takes is this seems like a good idea, and I'm going to plug forward. I remember having a very long talk with Mike Sandy when he was here at Michigan, back when people used to travel, and he was like, "You got to get a lab. You got to figure out a way to bring all the things that you're doing together under one roof." And like him, Michigan calls it the instructional track. So that's our tenure track. And I'm the only tenure track faculty member in med ed research in my department. And so you become this odd bird where you're being judged in a very different way for promotion. I was a lecturer for a long time when I was doing my PhD. So somebody called me middle-aged for the first time, and I was like, oh, in mid-career, and I was like, I've not achieved anything, but you're right. But I'm an assistant professor. I'm going up for tenure, hopefully in the near term. And that's a very different kettle of fish at Michigan than associate professor on our clinical track. They're very hard to get in both cases, but the standards by which they're judged are very different. I'm considered an outstanding teacher as an instructional track person. I'm a mediocre teacher probably compared to my actual education colleagues who actually focus on teaching people things. But in that same way that we're talking about Stanford's culture, Michigan has, I think, some similarities, right? And it helps to be able to say, yeah, you don't get what I do. You probably never will. But you can see that the forms and the ways that I approach things and what I have built matches or mirrors other people that are doing work in basic science or in health service or in other things, so that it's like when you write a grant. This is when we've talked about making grants. The form makes a big difference. If people can see what they're looking for, like the website for Pearl, right? If people can see that it exists and can understand it in their own frameworks, it goes a long way towards the immediate, like knee-jerk reaction was like, I don't think medical education research is a thing, right? Like that's still something that you fight, I think. Perhaps other places are more open. And so this was intentional on my own personal career. And then my own value system was, I want to be a good mentor. I want to be a great mentor. I think that's actually where I'm the best part of where I can be a teacher. I think I'm better at that than the other parts of education. And I wanted to build a collective where I could be successful and that others could be successful with less barriers. That the things that I had kind of slogged through, I could help others get through while still not having to take it all on myself. And so that's kind of the two pillars of why I tried to do this. It was naked self-interest and then some slight desire to help others at Michigan be successful. So.
I think that naked self-interest is probably a great descriptor for part of the reason why I started the early. I think I realized probably pretty early on in my sort of medical education path. So Mike had recruited me to Northwestern, who's my PD, when I started out there. And I really had a very early interest in medical education and education research. And so I was able to sort of form a team of researchers while I was at Northwestern and do some gender related research with respect to standardized letters of evaluation. Moving on to Ohio State, I realized very early on that there are many faculty who have such a huge amount of interest and, really want to get their feet wet. But one advantage that I had, my like secret hidden superpower, is that I had a master's of science in clinical research, which I earned during medical school. And I realized that I had this tool set that maybe not everyone had the opportunity to get this degree. And so it afforded me some foundational knowledge. And really, this is a way for me to get involved, from the self-interest standpoint, to get involved in all these really interesting research projects, but then also and hear what other people are doing. But then the other part of it is that I feel really strongly that maybe this like early career peer collaboration is so important, right? Like I think having peer support when you're junior faculty to run ideas, be like, hey, what do you think? Is this like a total unfeasible, ridiculous situation, or is this something that I can run with? I think that's really helpful because maybe some of us are, don't, maybe the senior people in our department don't have the same specific lines of research that we're looking at. I think that that has been really the driving reason. And so I'm going to go ahead and share. Share screen. I'm going to go ahead and share our website. And so I actually developed this innovative, let's start with the top. So this is the early splash page. Like Mike said, if you don't have a website, you don't exist. Like a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, so it even exists. And so going all the way down here, we actually have this innovative education research consultation service. And so this is really part of my intention with folks who want to talk about research ideas. And so essentially we ask for you to write just a rough abstract, right? Like get your idea down on paper, think about it, make it half baked by the time that you bring it to one of our research experts so that we can give you a little bit of feedback and let you know what are the parts in the design, the really early part of that research idea that you can do to strengthen your overall execution. So instead of conclusions, as a result that's already happened, we ask you to say, like, what do you think this is going to, what do you think the significance of your result is going to be as it fits into the existing body of what's known? And I have this awesome listing of all of our fantastic collaborators. These are like big names in medical education research. We have this wonderful statistician, Tim, and he works at Emory, and he has just been like a really great collaborator in terms of telling you what's a good idea and what's a bad idea, because he's the one who has like the superpower stats sort of brain. So I'm going to go ahead and stop share at this point. So really, I think in summary, the reason why early on I decided that I wanted this is, one, because I was interested, and two, because I wanted to make sure to form a collaborative with folks early on in their education careers where we could run ideas past each other.
Michael Casera wrote in the chat, it seems obvious that expertise and branding of expertise are key. It also seems apparent that the scientist distinction, as opposed to the educator, is an important and significant one for stakeholders to recognize. For all of you, how was this distinction created or fostered? Did you find this important in building a laboratory culture? And how did the distinction become accepted among other research scientists at your institution?
I'll start with this one. So, I told you why I created a lab. That was certainly from a marketing branding standpoint, honestly to market to medical students, right? So that they understood what we were doing. Then we realized that there was strategy for funding agencies. So now that I know there's all these other education labs in emergency medicine, it's not as easy to be the only education lab in the specialty, because we marketed that and leveraged that for some specialty specific grants. But I would assume all the other labs would be doing the same. So there was some strategy there. But local culture being what it is, we're still the only education lab on campus. There are other sort of simulation labs and things that look kind of similar in anesthesia and surgery that are named labs with foundational funding or development funds that are similar, but they're not sort of your basic science lab structure. So we went to the meetings of the labs I showed you the websites of as the examples, and it was completely ego deflating. They were very, very lovely people that had 4 or 5 postdocs, 4 or 5 medical students, visiting scholars. The table was full of people that they employed through their Rs. And these are tenure track faculty when there's 100 maybe tenure track faculty at Stanford in total. So it was great to see what we would aspire to be, but could probably not be in emergency medicine with the current funding structures that we have, unless we pivoted to our funding and probably went after National Science Foundation or art grants more than ours. But even ours, a lot of times there's sort of education grants in sheep's clothing, right? I've seen people win ours about teaching people about hypertension, and they're really just doing an education study, teaching people to return their opioid medicines after not using them all from a prescription. It's an education study, but they call it implementation science, but there's a little bit of education in there as well. So how you partner with folks and derive some success from that, I think is important. My last comment though will be how I started the lab at Stanford in my specific department. So we were having a chair search nationally, and our vice chair of operations was the interim chair, and he's very agreeable. And I said, I would like to have a lab, and he said, sure. And there's one other R-funded investigator in our department who has the Yang lab, a named lab, but none of the other research faculty have a named lab. And I told him the structure. He said, fine. And up goes our lab website, and we have a welcome. So then we hire a chair a few months later who is very lovely, Dr. Blomkans, and said something to the degree of, you'll always have support. However, what are we going to do now? Is everybody going to have a lab? Is there going to be the Michael lab and the Burkhardt lab and the Chan lab? Like, what do we do? And we have not answered these existential questions. We have a director of communications in our department who manages our website and our social media presence and press releases and things. And she doesn't link our lab from the website because she feels like it would get the traffic necessary to warrant space on the main department website. So, and then education scholarship is how we're defined by our research faculty, quote unquote, in our department. And it's been it's been a point of tension, frankly. And it's not ill will or bad people. It's just they don't believe that what we do is research. They don't. So having a lab, at least, I can have some sort of delineation that there is something formal going on here, that we've got as much funding as everybody else in the department in their non-named labs, unnamed labs. So I think until my colleagues start to have those big research tables with lots and lots of people paid for by their grants, I feel quite confident that we're doing good work. and that our work is equal to their work, but I don't know that they think the same of us. And that's really interesting because within the university, or at least the School of Medicine, the Pearl is a big deal. Like every time I'm invited to give a talk in another department, like the part they focus on is that the Pearl exists and that I'm the principal. And people have lots of questions about that because there isn't an equivalent in their departments, because none of the investigator track faculty are education researchers. So I don't know if I've shared, but there's lots of pros and cons to the branding marketing part, but I think it's so crucial to the success of the lab long-term that, and particularly I put in the chat box, like how you scale your lab, I think is going to be very important. So how you recruit postdocs and how you get visiting scholars to spend time with you, that's part of your strategic plan. You have to have a strategic plan, which I will say the Pearl, has a loose one. We're going to have an upcoming retreat where we kind of figure that stuff out a little bit better. But I think those things really, really matter. And I worry about that stuff way more than I worry about the science, which I guess is the role of the principal, but that's what, lab-wise keeps me up at night. And I see hands raised, so I'm gonna do the popcorn to Teresa.
All right, so I think that what Mike said is really important when you're starting up a lab where you're trying to go for funding. I think there's also the back end of it about creating, as John has said, that early career incubator model, just like Simia has been talking about, right? The idea is that a big part of it is the socialization of other people in the way that you do science. It's having those conversations. So in our lab, we have almost every Tuesday, or sometimes we shift it because of my schedule as an immerse doc is not consistent. And the idea would be almost every Tuesday we meet for an hour and a half, and we have a ritual. We have a place where the grad students all present what they're working on, one project. The postdocs have like 30 projects, so they have to pick one, and they pick ones that maybe they haven't talked about yet, or pick ones where there's a bit of a dilemma, or pick ones where they have had a success, like this is nearly ready to roll, and then we virtually high five everyone. And the idea would be that we actually have that as a roundabout. So if the 5 of you were in my lab, we would say, John, what you're working on, Sarah, what you're working on, and then we just pass the popcorn around, just like Shisani talked about, and then we go around and we actually ask burning questions. So burning questions are the ritual where we go through all the hard parts of science. So sometimes it'll be about branding. Sometimes they're like, do I need a website? Sometimes it's like, I don't know if I should have a Twitter account. People have been trolling me. Sometimes it'll be about, I don't know that anyone's read my paper. Should I do an infographic? Or I don't know how to pick the rest of my life. And then we're like, oh, okay, that's a hard one. But, and I invite other people in to come and actually guest star. So I have a friend, Sandra Montero, she brings her grad students. Sometimes there's an open invitation, obviously, to the rest of this crew here. If you ever want to drop by, I've just recently done a drop by Zoom bomb of the Pearl MedEd Fellows session as well. So I think that that's the cool thing about the digital space, is that you can create those exchanges of ideas, have new ideas on how to do things. And I think it allows for a touch point, which I think in the time of the pandemic has been really crucial, because a lot of our, especially our grad students who are not clinicians, they're having a hard time right now, right? So to have a network and to be able to support people and see people look forward to Tuesdays, which I think is a big compliment. But I think it's a really good touchstone to be able to say, I'm going to look forward to talking to people about things that aren't just, COVID and COVID or vaccinations, I guess, maybe to jazz it up there. So I'll kick it over now to John.
Yeah, I think kind of going back on the 2 questions about how did you build this, and then how did you establish yourself as an education scientist? When I did residency at Michigan as well, and during residency I did a master's degree, which was a little bit less common back then. It was before MedEd fellowships really existed at a high level, and I was looking at an academic job at a lot of different places, and I like to joke that Michigan was the lowest offer by $20,000 less than the next lowest offer of what they would give me. So it was by far the lowest paying job, but it was my home. But they also were willing to find non-monetary things that would be important. So One was they guaranteed to pay for my PhD. Bad choice, as long as I started with a number of years. I wanted to be on the 10-year instructional track because that was where researchers were. And that was the way that I was part of that tribe. And I'm sorry to hear how the issues with inter-researcher thing. I've been actually pretty welcomed by our research community. There was a thing where we used to have a meeting of all the kind of pre-tenure junior researchers from all disciplines. We'd meet once every couple of weeks. I referred to it as Dork Club because it was like the dorkiest EM docs in the world at Michigan. But I love that. And that has brought me, I think that has established me as in this, I count, right? And I think I do count and am considered in a different way than a lot of our other education people that do scholarship but aren't doing the stuff I do. I think my master's and PhD made a big thing in being like, hey, this is a real deal. But I think also being part of the next round of researchers, right? So, the meetings had Scott Van Epps, who does nanoparticle research. It had Patrick Carter, who's doing a ton of firearms research right now. It had Will Moyer and Keith Coker. Will's doing stroke. Keith's doing health services stuff. Michelle Macy was there at the time. It was a lot of people that are doing a lot of, I think, interesting things, but totally different things. But the department said, this was our associate chair of research, who's now the vice president for research at Michigan, Rebecca Cunningham, said, you are all together. You are all a cohort. You are all a community. And I think that was a great departmental choice that hugely benefited me because I was out by myself in a lot of ways. Nobody else was doing what I was doing. Nobody else thought about this stuff perhaps in the same way because I was trying to build a different kind of career than a lot of our educators have in the past. And having that community went a huge way to both legitimizing me amongst the other researchers, and helping me find my own identity as a researcher. And then I did some of the stuff as I've started to build this. We have a great med ed researcher, Brian George in surgery, who's built this really cool C-STAR program. I went to some of his meetings. Again, some of the same stuff that you're hearing is I tried to learn and steal from the best that other people are doing and see what parts worked for me and what parts didn't work for me. So like I have a meeting on Mondays. Now because I don't have enough grist or power, it's kind of a virtual meeting on Slack more than like an in-person Zoom. And I just send me messages and try and get stuff back. And I kind of tell people, can you try and be around this time? Because I'll be trying to reach out to you. And my hope is that eventually I'll be able to build the communities that Teresa and Mike are talking about, but I don't have that quite yet. I have a community in that these are my colleagues and we're friends, but I don't have the kind of lab community. That's still kind of coming on board because it's just been something I've been working on over the last year where I've really been trying to be moving from kind of this vague idea to a very intentional, branded specific thing. So I hope that answers kind of some of the things. I think there is a real importance to that distinction. I know that's not fair. It isn't. But I have made it very clear through both actions and words that I'm in the same space. So I presented at our research day the work I'm doing, and it was sandwiched between the people that are doing NIH funding. And the idea was it's the same thing. And it's the same rigor. You just have to demonstrate that. And it helps do good work too. I mean, if you can say like, look at this is real work. So I'll shut it down.
I'm just going to jump in on that just to add a little bit, because I think that even though I'm in a center where like people, I've just put in a link to, and just in case you don't know who Jeff Norman is, he's one of the giants in med ed. It literally is a giant. He's like 7 feet tall, I think. And he was like, you're a short one. I'm like, yeah, I think everyone's short compared to you. And the idea would be that he's been a mentor of mine. He's carved out a niche, but he's a PhD scientist, right? And so even at a shop where there's a long history, Michigan has a long history as well, right, of education scientists. Clinician education scientists have usually not actually existed as much, right? John Charbonneau is probably one of the first, right? And building off of his template has allowed me to build off of a shoulder of not someone that's not quite a giant, but definitely taller than me. And so I can stand on his shoulders, and then maybe we're as tall as Jeff together, stacked on top of each other.
The good thing I would say, so we have a Department of Learning Health Sciences that used to be the med ed department at Michigan. Mm-hmm. There's a number of really big people. Larry Gruppin's the former chair of the med ed ranks, and they're PhD, not clinicians. And I got a joint appointment over there. I worked with them. I tried to model a lot of this stuff. In fact, my chair in emergency medicine has always been saying, we got to figure out a way to make sure that we've positioned you so that you look like them. They have tenure. Even though you're a clinician scientist, if your science is as good as theirs and similar to theirs, then what could the argument be? And so that is another thing, is you look elsewhere in your institution for people that are in this education scientist mode that may not be clinicians, and model to some extent how you.
And then I think it's about having conversations and doing that knowledge translation and some faculty development of people who are scientists and seeking. I mean, but the biggest thing I think wins for me have been to seek career scientist advice about how to be a better scientist. And then all of a sudden, like, oh, I helped make that girl successful. I helped make that guy successful, right? Being able to actually link people to the idea that they're sponsoring you has been really, really helpful. Like meeting with my vice chair of research, meeting with other researchers, meeting with the people on tenure promotion committee, just to talk a little bit about how, like I do education science, I'm still in the clinician educator track, but it doesn't matter because I'm allowed to do whatever I want. And to be honest, they don't hold any power over me because I work for a single payer health system, and then that funds my faculty position. So really, there's like really very little deliverables that they're asking of me. And I've exceeded most of the guardrails because most clinician educators in my track aren't expected to do any scholarship or research. But when I went out for a big award recently called the University Scholar, that's where they pick out 6 to 10, depending on the year, scientists that they put forward as scientists. I was able to make the cut. And so I'll be the first health professions education research and scholar to be featured in that group. And so that was announced like last week, and it means that we're heading in the right direction. But I have to acknowledge that I am building off of the backs of people like John Charbonneau and Jeff Norman, who have had this long legacy of that. And so just like any inequity, it takes time to build there. And I acknowledge fully that I am in a privileged position that I'm building off of the backs of others in order to climb to where I am. But now that I've shattered that glass ceiling, now it's go time for everyone else.
Yeah, and I think it's my grant writing, my work has gotten better by having part of my mentorship team be researchers that are not med ed. So Rebecca Cunningham has been big, our current associate chair for research. I was just meeting with Philip Scott. Collaborating with non-med ed researchers make you think about things in a different way. I think the first grant I wrote, I didn't know that you had to have a specific games page. Right now, I've read 1 million Ks and 1 million Rs, and again, that form about grant writing. But it's not just the grant writing; it's this idea of what does a scientist look like in other fields, and what are the kind of general things you can surface from their work to apply to yours.
Agreed. I mean, I think that's the thing about education scientists. Often you're very lonely, like Jeff, Mike has explained, and John has explained, and Jeff has explained over and over again. He was like the only guy doing it for a long time. And I think that that's key, is that the science is very similar. So whether you're subbing in an intervention that's a health services intervention, they're probably more akin to us than the people that develop pills, for instance, right? Then I think that you can get role modeling and you can get sponsorship. And if you're writing a grant without having read 5 of the previous winning grants, you need to kind of like think about how you actually strategize around your grant writing, because I think a big part of winning grants is actually seeing how other people won them and getting in on the inside. So making alliances with people who do implementation science, health services research, that group of people, they've had to fight the good fight. So they're now, they're all piled up there winning grants now for the first time. They're happy to help people up usually. And so when we're going up for research chair kind of awards and stuff like that, I've got a stockpile of 4 or 5 different ones, right? Where we actually go through that. And I just note that our one of our very senior luminaries in medical education, David Sklar, has just chimed in, and I'll read his comment there for the people who are watching the recording. David says, I think we also need to educate our own researchers in emergency medicine who give out the money for SAEM, EF and EMF, who do not understand education research funding has been a big issue. Ultimately, we also need to get players like Medicare and Medicaid to fund our research. That's where the real money is for us. And I think that's 100%. Like it's about, to me, tenure promotion barriers or granting agency barriers, to me, maybe because I'm now the assistant DFX development, that's a development issue. That's a they don't really get it and we need to teach them kind of issue.
Yeah, and I think some things, I'm on the I don't know who's been on the grants committee for SAM. I've done that for the last few years, and I think that helps get you in the conversation. I just sent an email to the chair because I think there was something in the now what was the fellowship grant, which helped launch my career, is now that I was like, this doesn't make sense, and I haven't heard back from them yet. But getting another way to get in that conversation, right? You establish yourself as, I'm just like you, right? All the other people that are bringing it, you're not, but you're in that club, and then you have a voice in that club. And because you put in, and we need more, because when I first started doing it, there were almost nobody. Like the reviews were done by non-education people. Now they're doing, I would argue that most reviews are being done by a combination of Stanford and Michigan. So be nice to us, or join us, because I think that's the way that you get in the inside and you can affect change. I think we need to rise in the ranks of SAM to get to be better advocates, but sometimes being on the inside, you can start those conversations.
All right, thank you all so much for this awesome conversation. I wish that we had a whole nother hour to dive in even more. I look forward to talking with the team. It sounds like we've got maybe a paper going in the chat here. So take care, all of you. Please reach out to any of us if you're an audience member and feel like there's someone who could help you achieve your goals, because I know everybody here is totally invested in the success of MedEd investigators.
Thank you for having us, Sarah.
Thank you for coming. This was awesome. It was a lot of fun.
It was fun.